We're very happy to be joined just recently back from Cuba, Manolo De Los Santos, who's a researcher, the co-director of the People's Forum here in New York, also with, I said, researcher with Tricontinental Institute, Tricontinental getting a lot of publicity here, rightfully so, here on the freedom side. Manolo, thank you so much for joining us. Are you muted?
I hope he's muted.
I think he's muted.
Or he lost, did he lose his voice in Cuba?
I hope not. No,
I did not lose my voice in Cuba.
There we go.
I was just so
Yay,
excited to
Manolo!
be on. I was so excited to be on the air with y'all.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, as we mentioned, Manolo, you were just there in Cuba. I mean, I almost don't know where to start because there's so many things. I mean, there's their rate of vaccination, their development of vaccines. Maybe the first question I'll just ask you is, if there was one thing you wish people in the US knew about what was happening in Cuba around vaccinations and COVID-19, what would that be?
I mean, it's the thing that blew my mind when I was there recently, which is that Cuba has been developing vaccine research for over 30 years. I mean, that's the most impressive thing. I mean, that this little blockaded country of 11 million people with no resources really has managed to pull off vaccines in so many different like urgent fields of medicine. And for COVID alone, and I would say in a period of less than a year, has developed 7, of which 3 are already sort of, fully being used in Cuba and are being sent to other countries. I mean, what other third world country really can say we have produced 7 vaccine programs, to vaccinate our own people, but also to help the world? I mean, that is ultimately the most impressive feat and almost, the middle finger in the face of the US.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think has been deeply notable about what we've seen in Cuba has been just the speed of the vaccination program and how quickly they've been able to get so many people vaccinated. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, or wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because it does seem to also relate very closely to Cuba's healthcare system, which has rightfully become world famous for not only its comprehensive nature, but also its internationalism. But talk about how people relate to the healthcare infrastructure and how that relates to the speed and the scale of how many people they've been able to get vaccinated relatively quickly.
Well, one of the things I was constantly asking friends, family, comrades in Cuba is, how are you actually able to vaccinate so many people without a mandate? Are you having to force people to get vaccines? And I think the constant sort of answer, the story that I kept hearing over and over again in different parts of Havana was that, why would we need to mandate if there's a public healthcare system that's been in place for over 50 years, in which people are seeing themselves as participants and not patients? The fact that everyone is in constant communication with their community doctors, that throughout this pandemic, everyone has been taken care of by the public healthcare system. There is no space, there's no gap in the relationship between doctors, hospitals, and the people. So the vaccine is almost seen as just a continuation of what have been, I would say, pretty successful over 50 years of medical attention on the island that is free of cost, no questions asked, and remarkable also that the service, the attention to detail that the Cubans provide, to the point that, everyone doesn't get the same vaccine, depending on everyone's personal medical history. Your community doctor already recommends which of the Cuban vaccines you would be receiving. I mean, it's this level of attention to detail that I think creates trust from the Cuban people in their healthcare system. So no one questions neither the origins, the safety, or the viability of actually getting vaccinated in Cuba.
Yeah.
No,
go ahead.
Manolo, oh, sorry. Oh,
no,
I was just going to say, I love the idea of calling it vaccine revolution, because it goes even beyond Cuba, right? Like, there are so many countries, even in the region, like you think about the situation for a country like Venezuela, which is under a siege just like Cuba is in many ways, and how that's preventing it from having access to vaccines as well as other countries. So just like Cuba has provided these third world countries and sometimes first world countries with doctors, with their medical brigades, is there a similar situation we might see with the vaccine? Could this vaccine potentially help, and maybe has it already helped countries in the region and have a potential to help countries internationally that are also desperate for vaccines as the global north and its pharmaceutical companies block the waiving of patent rights and are making it essentially impossible for poorer countries to access these vaccines?
Well, when I was in Havana and speaking to the directors of the Biotechnology Center, the CIGB, which produces the Abdala vaccine, which was one of the first of the five that has actually come into massive use in Cuba. The first thing they started talking about was, well, we live in a world where there are essentially five companies who basically control the whole vaccination programs around the world. They control the flow, the production, the distribution of vaccines in the world. So we are basically trying to basically not just work within the margins or deal with our own needs, but trying to break through this system that excludes the majority of people on the planet from equal access to vaccination, not just for COVID, but for so many urgent and basic needs in healthcare. The fact that Cuba is not trying to do this only by sending vaccines, which it is, it's just a few days ago, it sent a first shipment of 1 million vaccines to Nicaragua. There are agreements of sending vaccines to Vietnam, to Venezuela, to Iran. But the more important thing, I think, and it's I think why it's correct to say it's a vaccine revolution, which is that Cuba is actually transferring the technology to produce these vaccines to other countries. I mean, Vietnam has an agreement where Cuban technology is being transferred there, and there's going to be an autonomous plant producing vaccines, Cuban vaccines in Vietnam for the Southeast Asian region. There is a transfer of technology to Iran, which is also facing huge sanctions, so that Iran has the capacity to produce its own vaccines and actually develop further on with already Cuban research. China itself has already received several transfers of Cuban technology on vaccine development. So all these, I think, elements are indicative of how Cuba sees itself not just as a provider of services, of vaccines, of medicine, but of actually transforming the politics and the political economy of vaccine, what I would call, and Tricontinental calls the vaccine apartheid that we live under right now.
Mm-hmm. No, well, it certainly is when you look at the just absolute denial of what's going on. I mean, Cuba is I think, really stands alone in what they're doing, and everything that you just laid out in terms of, the various other nations they're working with. I believe Vietnam's taking 10 million of the vaccine in just their first shipment. But I mean, certainly, I don't think anyone is doing anything close to what they're doing in terms of helping people, technology transfers, and other pieces. And I just wonder also, Manolo, you were there on the island, and in the context of COVID, I know we've seen, a lot of challenges for Cuba, of course, and a lot of challenges economically and other pieces like that in relationship to tourism and many of the ways that, commerce happens there. What was the feeling? What was the situation there on the island, just in terms of I guess maybe the broader social reality, which I think, many people saw just a couple months ago, did lead to the protests and other things that folks were pointing to in terms of showing some of these challenges?
Well, it's an extremely difficult moment. I can't lie, I can't hide the gruesome fact that this US war on Cuba is asphyxiating the people of Cuba. I mean, it's strangling the people of Cuba. And it hurts even more because, despite Cuba's achievements, despite Cuba's ability to already, within a matter of months, vaccinate already over 61% of its population is fully vaccinated already. The rest will be fully vaccinated. Over 93% will be fully vaccinated by November 15th. That is an amazing feat. But they're facing severe shortages of food, of medicine. They're facing extreme, electricity outages. And I know Rania knows about that, because this is also seen in countries like Lebanon due to sanctions as well.
Yes.
But this is a cruel reality that basically the sanctions have been as cruel or even worse than the pandemic itself in taking away Cuba's ability to survive in this moment. And, I can say that there isn't hunger in Cuba. There isn't people aren't dying because of lack of food or medicine. But the blockade is making it much and much harder for there to continue to be a guaranteed equal access to all these supplies, you know? And I think the Cuban people are not ones to give up, but this is a moment where definitely the world needs to stand up with the Cuban people and actually denounce what these US sanctions are. And not just the sanctions, but the fact that the US government continues in its attempts to overthrow the Cuban government.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I was just going to say, that's amazing what you just said. You said the sanctions are worse than the pandemic itself. That right there is an incredible statement. And I'm just curious, because of that, like one day is being too generous. It was a few hours of like people maybe like protesting a little bit. And of course, the US media talked about it nonstop. It really was like an operation in every way possible, a regime change operation, and it failed miserably. But of course, like I spoke to you at the time, Manolo, about those protests and about the sentiment on the island, about the economic situation, which has gotten so much worse. And I'm curious, when you were there, what was the conversation around that? Other than, of course, people are suffering. Like we understand, people are suffering very extremely. People are suffering a lot because of these sanctions. But is it causing discontent with the government, or are people recognizing that it is the U.S. at fault?
Well, I think there are high levels of frustration right now, and naturally so, because again, just like we talked about in July of earlier this year, that you know it's almost 60 years of blockade, over 60 years of sanctions in place that have accumulated, in the level of stress and havoc and chaos that they, throw on the Cuban people. Add to that every possible sanction that Trump could think of in the last 4 years. The fact that remittances still are not being allowed to be sent from the United States or to be received in Cuba. That Biden has not moved an inch to even, offer the most, I would say, the most meaningful thing that could continue to help Cuban families right now, independent of the government. Um, there is high frustration with all of this. And I think there is a segment of the population, there are people that I talk to on the streets, on the ground, that definitely see the continued hand of the US government. The fact that the Biden administration, hasn't flinched in sight of the pain of the Cuban people right now. The fact that they have not even offered the most even smallest of changes in policy towards Cuba is making it clear that there is definitely uh, an intentionality of the Biden administration to basically suffocate Cuba and to suffocate it into submission. And I think that's where a lot of Cubans, regardless of how they feel about the revolution, regardless of how they feel about the socialist project, when faced with the options of either submission, by force, or being fiercely independent and patriotic, the response is always, we prefer a country that is free, that is independent, even if it means continuing to live 4 more years, 10 more years, 60 more years under sanctions and blockades.
Well, Manolo, one thing I want to ask you about, I mean, I've heard some rumors that I think it is November 15th. That interesting combination there with the rise of everyone being vaccinated. I've heard some rumors that some of these US-backed networks may try another provocation in Cuba to turn sentiment against the Cuban Revolution here in the United States. What have you heard about this? Does this seem, legitimate or what?
Well, I will say it even clearer, Eugene. I don't think there are US-backed networks planning anything. I think the US government is very clearly organizing and directing for what will be another scenario for intervention and counter-revolution in Cuba on November 15th. This is a date chosen by the US government. They are the ones who are basically creating the propaganda around it, both through official spokespersons like the Washington Post, that for some reason now every 2-3 days has to put out a new editorial or a new story on why there is a need for regime change on the island. They are US funded and literally media projects funded by USAID and the NED that every day now are creating propaganda that, directed towards Cubans on the island, encouraging, quite contradictory messages of both civil and nonviolent protests, and at the same time, violent actions to overthrow the government on November 15th, which is terrible because this is all happening at the same time that Cuba is going to be opening up again to tourism on November 15th. In a sense, this is another US government attempt to sabotage the livelihood of Cubans. Cubans are saying, after 2 years of pandemic, we want to go back to some sense of normality. We want to go back to being able to open our businesses, our small private restaurants, our tourist businesses, and so on. And the US government is saying, we are going to sabotage that too. So we have to be on a high alert, I would say, that for November 15th, the US government is preparing probably its major operation, its biggest operation of propaganda, of counter-revolution, of intervention against the Cuban project.
I mean, this just seems, again, I think, well, Ronnie, you said it earlier, when I said something that's unbelievable, it's both unbelievable and totally believable. I mean, the idea that there's any sort of threat posed to America. I mean, it just feels like the opposite to me when we think about the impact of the sanctions on Cuba obviously are devastating, and we know that. But it seems to me, Manolo, that the people of the United States are also losing out by this policy of blockade, this policy of an attempt to destroy Cuba, and have no cooperation on any front at all.
I mean, being fully honest with you, I think actually the US people are the biggest losers in this game of sanctions and blockades. Partly because the US population, for example, loses out on the fact that Cuba, again, part of its decades of research into vaccines, loses out, for example, on Cuba's vaccines against diabetic ulcers. It loses out on Cuba's cancer vaccines and treatments. Mm-hmm. It loses out against decades of medical research that could actually save the lives of millions of people in the United States. I mean, Cuba's research into lung cancer has saved lives of many Cubans. Imagine the lives of the miners it could save in places like Kentucky and North Carolina and other parts of the United States, where lung cancer rates are through the roof. But also imagine the cultural wealth that could be shared with the people of the United States by simply having an open door policy, a policy of being neighbors to this small country that's just 90 miles away. I mean, there's so many possibilities that are lost. I don't think we can ever fully even put a value to how much is lost in terms of the human interactions in this sad reality, this cruel reality of the sanctions and the blockade.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's in a way, it's almost like that's the other aspect of Cuba. That is the national security threat to the US. I mean, when you think about what the US considers national security, it's the security of its corporations, the security of its pharmaceutical industry. How terrible for the American pharmaceutical industry would it be if Cuba's like freely available medical technology to save you from lung cancer became available to Americans?
How horrible.
Or it's cheap. No, seriously. I mean, think about it. It's free medical, it's free healthcare system. People go to the doctor and it's free. People go to university for free. I mean, that's the big threat that Cuba represents. It's not just, of course it is because Cuba maintains independence and forges its own path, but it also has an alternative system of socialism that works and that's fair and that's equitable. And if Americans were to actually understand the truth about that idea alone could be such a huge threat. So they have to suffocate it. That's just more of that's more commentary than a question, of course. But it is in that sense, if you're an American elite, if you're the head of the US empire, that's in charge of making sure that all of these companies have access to all the, cheap labor and cheap resources they can get, then Cuba is a national security threat.
Yeah. And I would add, Rania, that it's the same people, the same forces of white supremacy, the same forces of the ultra-rich in this country that deny millions of workers here the right to healthcare are constantly the same ones who are opposed to, at this moment, building better relations with Cuba. those are the ones who continue to finance and project counter-revolution towards Cuba.
Well, Manolo De Los Santos, really appreciate you, as always, joining us here on the show, freshly back from Cuba and helping dispel all the myths that are out there about the island and the struggle that it's waging very righteously. Thanks for giving us some of your time and being with us on the Freedom Side.
Always a pleasure to be here with y'all.
Pleasure is all ours.